To insert the partial button placket of the Lettie skirt, you will begin by taking one full length flat piping piece. You're going to open it so that the wrong side is facing you, and you will be working on the right end. With a ruler, you will begin by measuring and marking the end of the button placket facing, which is the one that's shorter. The button shield is a ½ inch longer. So you'll mark the end of that, and then you will mark the seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. After marking your seam allowance guide, you will be marking the center of each buttonhole opening. If you work from the bottom, or I guess the end point of the button placket facing, there's going to be a wider section, and that will be like the base of your button placket. And then there will be 5 buttonhole openings. This is the center point for each one. There's 1½ inches between each. Once you've marked those, you can extend the line, the marking down to your seam allowance line, so you really know the center point of each of your buttonholes. And then you will mark the width from each side. The pattern calls for ½ inch buttons. If you are using a different width, you will need to adjust that for your buttons. So mark the width for each button. And then I like to extend this line out to the edge of the flat piping and exit out so that I know exactly where the buttonholes are going to be and where I'm not going to be sewing. After your buttonholes openings have been marked, you will take one skirt panel and match the flat piping along the wearer's right side. And you're going to match right sides together of the skirt panel and the flat piping. You're going to pin along your marked edge, ending at the end point that you marked for your the button placket facing. Once pinned in place, you will sew along your seam allowance guide with a 2mm seam stitch length. You want to make sure to not stitch the buttonhole openings. You can see after stitched together you have small openings where the buttons will go. Now at the base of the button placket opening, you will first clip into the flat piping, making sure to clip only into the flat piping and not the skirt panel. I accidentally clipped into both. You're going to do this on both sides. If you accidentally clip into the skirt panel, it is okay. It'll correct itself later. Once clipped, you will draw yourself a guideline a 1/4 inch away from your stitch line. Draw that line and then trim off just the flat piping. Once trimmed, you will press this trimmed edge towards the center of the skirt. You're going to be pressing along the seam line. If at all possible, try to maintain the center pressed edge of the flat piping, if you can. Now working on the untrimmed edge of the flat piping, you're going to fold and press in towards the wrong side by a 1/4 inch. You will do this all the way down to the clipped edge. Once pressed, you will fold it over again so that the pressed edge that you just did will now meet the center pre-pressed edge of the flat piping. Once that's been pressed into place, you will then be able to fold along the center pressed edge, and the trimmed piping on the outside edge there will then be able to be enclosed within the flat piping. It can be a little tricky to make sure everything is all lined up, but just make sure to press firmly along all the edges so that the trimmed edge is completely covered and concealed by the untrimmed portion of the flat piping. Once it's pressed in place, you will then pin just the flat piping. Do not pin the skirt, just the flat piping. Pin along the whole pressed edge. You can see the exposed buttonhole openings. You can pin from either direction depending on how you want to work and feed it through your sewing machine. Once pinned in place, you will switch back to a regular stitch line, a regular stitch length, sorry, and you will stitch along the whole pressed edge there, making sure to not stitch over the holes because you want to maintain your openings. Now you're going to take your prepared button placket facing. Once again, this is your shorter piece, and you are going to align the angled edge, the angled edges of the piece with the skirt panel, and you're going to pin in place just along the edge of the facing. Working from the wrong side of the skirt, you can sew the piece in place. And you want to make sure you're kind of using the button holes as your guide. You're going to sew just right next to that on the outer edge. Once it's sewn in place, you're going to press the button placket facing away from the skirt panel. Now you will take another skirt panel, and on the right side of the fabric, but working along the wearer's left side, you will pin the button shield in place. Then working from the bottom of the button shield up, you will mark a point along the angled edge of the skirt panel, 1/2 inch up. Then, using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you will sew the button shield in place, making sure to stop at that point. Then you're going to clip into the skirt panel at the end of the seam line, just the skirt panel, not the button shield, and bring the button shield to the back or kind of fold it away from the skirt panel, which can be finished either with a zigzag stitch or with bias binding. Now you will press the button shield away from the skirt panel and edge stitch along the pressed edge. Now you're going to take both of your skirt panels and mark the slit position along the angled edge of each one as directed in the instructions. Once you've marked the slit position, you're going to match the angled edges of the skirt panels together, making sure that the flat piping is sandwiched in between and aligned with the raw edges. You want to make sure that the button placket facing and the button shield are both out and away from the skirt panels, and you're going to align the clips at the base of each. The button shield will be longer than the button facing. And you want to align your seam lines along your buttonholes and pin at the top so that everything stays together. You will then sew the skirt panels together using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You will begin at the base of the facing and sew over the end of the shield and stop at the slit point. Once the two panels are sewn together, You will pin the remaining flat piping in place on the center skirt panel. Pin all the way down to the bottom of the skirt. Then you will start sewing directly at the point of the previous seam line, all the way down the angled edge of the skirt panel using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. At the end of the skirt panel, you will follow along your angled seam allowance guide. You're going to open your skirt panels now and press the flat piping towards the right side of the skirt and press the facing towards the center. If you need to trim the seam allowance at the top of the facing, do so now. With the facing towards the center, nice and flat, you're going to pin the button placket facing in place. Once pinned in place, you can draw yourself a edge stitching guide along the edge of your facing and then sew the facing in place. That the buttonhole and openings are aligned with the seam line of the button shield. Pin in place at the top to make sure it all stays in place. And then at the bottom, at the base of the button shield, secure at the base. Draw yourself a guideline at the base of the button shield and then a line parallel to that 1 1/4 inches above. These points will be the base of your button placket. Sew along those guidelines. And now your button placket is complete.